The last few weeks, we've been treated to some discussion about a woman named Kim Davis from Kentucky. And so what I'm going to seek to do in the few minutes that I have with you is to complicate that situation a little bit. Because if you're like me and you're following on social media, it's pretty easy to know where people fall. And it's usually on one side or the other. And I'm hoping that after the few minutes of hearing me talk about this, you may end up with your same position, but you'll have it a little bit more complicated. So that's my goal. We want to think about the broad notions of where there are intersections between religious freedom and civil rights. And if we think back through our history, and we don't have time to go through it all, there's some tender spots there. And those are the spots on which I'd like to put my thumb today. So let's set up some context first in the eye of Kim Davis. I'm taking you back to an important founding document, the 10th Federalist Paper, where James Madison writes about the violence of faction and his concern that if we're going to have a democracy, if we're going to have a system of government where people not only have natural passions and proclivities that differ from one another, but are encouraged to express them and to have a government based on those, that we're going to have divides, we're going to have faction. And the question was, could the system of government that the framers put together in Philadelphia withstand those kind of pressures? He argues yes, but for our purposes, I really just want to hone in on his distinction between majority faction and minority faction. Because he warns us that while minority factions might be problematic, the simple democratic principle of majority rule will oftentimes keep those factions in check. That the larger question, and perhaps a bigger concern at times, will be majority faction. Because he didn't believe in playground democracy. It's not simply the fact that if you have more people, you must be right. That the rights of the minority need to always be attended to. And by minorities, he wasn't talking about racial or ethnic minorities because they were completely excluded from his line of thinking. Beyond that, we need to think about the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which lays out a number of the freedoms and liberties that we have come to enjoy and expect. In particular, the religion we'll talk about in a moment, but also various forms of expression. And so that's going to be important. And then the 14th Amendment, because a lot of the discussion that we're having at this moment is really about state governments and the right of states to make their own laws and determinations. And the Bill of Rights applies to the states through the 14th Amendment in a process that's known in constitutional law as incorporation. And then finally, this Supreme Court decision that was made earlier this year that effectively invalidated the laws of the remaining states that outlawed same-sex marriage. And so it's in the wake of this decision back in June that we start to learn more about Kim Davis and about the issues that she represents. But in between, before the decision was made this June, we've had very recent examples where religious freedom came into contrast with public opinion and with policy. For instance, after the Affordable Care Act was passed, a number of religious institutions, I have Wheaton College just up the road here, as well as private corporations that have religious boards like Hobby Lobby, sued the federal government because they did not like the provision that it mandated them to offer birth control to the women in their corporation, because some of the forms of birth control, their religious convictions were incompatible with their religious convictions. When it became known that the Chick-fil-A Corporation had been funding anti-LGBT rights campaigns throughout the country, there was an encouragement for LGBT rights activists to boycott that restaurant chain. Only Monday through Saturday, though, because boycotting it on Sunday wouldn't do you any good because they're closed. For that exact reason. There was a pushback then, and we saw a lot of social media activity around supporting Chick-fil-A with the vastly uninformed notion that the boycott was somehow infringing on their First Amendment rights to expression. Of course, the First Amendment applies to government stopping or infringing, and not necessarily boycotts, which are perfectly constitutionally legal. So after some states started to legalize gay marriage, but before the Supreme Court weighed in, a number of private companies in states where gay marriage were legal that provide services to weddings started to come into the spotlight. Bakers, florists, would say it's against my religious convictions to participate in gay weddings, and so I'm not going to do that. We have our business, and we'll certainly serve gay people. Send your partner flowers on Valentine's Day, but we're not going to be involved in your wedding. Lawsuits, a number of these cases are in various stages of litigation and appeal at this point. So those are still ongoing. So this is all even before the Supreme Court weighs in. And then afterwards, we get Ms. Davis, who, as a county clerk in Rowan County, Kentucky, was responsible for issuing marriage licenses. She decided after the court's decision in June that she was going to stop doing that. Not that she was only going to refuse licenses to gay couples, but she wasn't going to issue any marriage licenses at all. This, of course, brought lots of attention, and because everybody's got video cameras now on their phones, lots of videos that could go viral, a particular gay couple waiting in line, being ignored, asking to have a license, continually being denied, and then that gets some traction. Federal court order moved her to issue licenses anyway. She refused that federal court order, was found in contempt of court, served 5 days in federal prison, and she was then released under orders to not interfere with the issuing of licenses. So her deputies are issuing licenses that have very carefully worded statements on them that they're not a part of her conviction. So what we need to deal with here is what it means. Is she, as many would claim, a Rosa Parks of her generation? Rosa Parks, of course, a very principled person who was committed to social justice and engaged in one of the most famous acts of civil disobedience in the nation's history, when on December 1st, 1955, she intentionally boarded a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and sat in a seat that was reserved for whites and refused the bus driver's order to move, was subsequently arrested, and a 13-month boycott of the Montgomery bus system ensued. We hold her up as a champion of civil rights, as somebody who stood in the face of vast oppression. And many are holding Kim Davis up in a similar light. So is she Rosa Parks, or is she George Wallace? George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, who on June 11, 1963, famously stood at the steps of Foster Auditorium at the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, to prevent the enrollment of 2 African Americans to that great institution. So she may be one of those 2 people. Depending on where you stand, on one hand, she's a bigot, she's in the way of progress, she's a relic, right? In fact, she is acting in contrary to public opinion. The most polls show now that Americans, the majority of Americans support same-sex rights and same-sex marriage, in fact. And that in the face of that, she's acting in some opposition, right? On the other hand, her supporters would say that her First Amendment rights are being violated. Her right to express herself, and in fact, she's the modern-day David standing up against the Goliath of public opinion. And if we think back to what Madison said, we need people who are going to stand up against the majority. The majority is not. We can think about times in our history where just because something was popular didn't make it good. Slavery is a good example. I'm guessing nobody here is in support of slavery anymore. Hope not. If so, please keep it to yourself. Internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Nickelback. I mean, just because something's popular doesn't make it right. Just keep that in mind. All right. But so where do we go with this? We have to figure out if there's any basis in not only our founding principles, but in constitutional law. And so we drill down a little bit into looking at the language of the First Amendment. And those first 2 clauses are the clauses that give us guidance here. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So Congress and the government cannot establish an official religion or have religion be an undue influence in our lives, so the interpretation goes. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So there's 2 clauses that pertain to religion, right? One is about the establishment, and the government can't establish religion or have undue influence. And the other is that people cannot be prohibited from expressing their religious preferences. And of course, there's limits to all of these, as is always the case in constitutional law. What's important for us, of course, is that from the perspective of the LGBT rights folks, Kim Davis is violating the Establishment Clause. Because as a government employee, her refusal to follow the law is imposing her religious beliefs onto other people, onto the populace. From Kim Davis's perspective, she's saying that these orders are violative of her right to practice her religion as she is instructed and as she best understands it. That, in a sense, her free exercise is being infringed upon, right? So there's some differences there. You know what I meme? I'll be here all week. Or you're just getting it now? Settle in. If you're like me and you're on social media, as I said at the beginning of the talk, you probably know where you stand, and you have people who are like-minded, who share your beliefs, and then you have people who you hid or defriended, who are annoying you and don't share your beliefs. But the memes have been coming fast and quickly and furiously, so let's take a look at some of these. Right? The idea here is that what is Kim Davis to do? If she really believes that God will not allow her to participate in these proceedings, how can we ask her to do something that's against her conscience? And one of the responses is quit. You don't have to do anything that's against your conscience, but as somebody who's sworn to uphold the laws of your state, you have to do that, or you are not. On the other hand, of course, doesn't she have a right and an obligation, if she really believes something's wrong, to not follow an unjust law, right? More of these. And my favorite. No, that's not my favorite. That's a good one too. This one's my favorite. Remember Fabio, he didn't believe it wasn't butter. He did his job. But there's some other memes too. Some of them were unflattering, and some of them about her personal appearance, which I chose not to show. I don't think that's relevant at all. But some are pointing out what is perceived to be hypocrisy on her part, that she's been married a number of times. And so this is sort of a meme that's getting at that, her hypocrisy. Another one here, can't give out marriage licenses because she used them all herself. Again, probably unfair at a very basic level, but on the other hand, because it's a substantive issue and there's some hypocrisy involved, it's not surprising that we're seeing a number of these. Now, the last one I wanted to show you is a little bit more substantive. Right? I mean, in other words, the suggestion here is that it's an imposition of her beliefs on everybody else. Right? Because I'm on a diet, I'm not giving you a burger. This is important and it makes good sense, but it's easy to flip it around. You put a different picture with the meme, and supporters of hers could argue the same thing. Just because you all believe that gay marriage is correct and appropriate and just doesn't mean you should make me be involved with facilitating that process, right? And so I think this one in particular gets at that intersection and that tender spot in a very, very important way. So what do we make of her? Well, her lawyer believes that she's one of the bravest women in America. She remains the single bravest woman in America. Okay, I understated his praise. She's the single bravest woman in America because, again, she's being held up as somebody who's on principle going against public opinion. And that's certainly something that we value. If you're in favor of LGBT rights, you look back at the people who were fighting for those rights well before it was popular to do so and hold them up as examples of people that in the face of injustice are fighting. You may not believe that she's doing that, but certainly she believes that and her supporters believe that, and I think that's what complicates this case. Thank you.